Good afternoon, everybody. Mr. Druid here, and I'm going to cover the Chapter 2 outline with you. Now, this outline won't be too detailed because we're going to cover that a lot in our Chapter 2 additional notes. That's where a lot of our lecture is going to be coming from, but I will try to cover a little bit in here. So starting off with Section 1. So starting off in Section 1 is talking about our political beginnings, and it's good to know some basic concepts. The colonists always wanted a limited government, and that means they didn't want their individual rights to be taken away. So they wanted the government to be limited in power, and that will be a main theme you will see throughout our government, and we will explain that a lot in the coming chapters. And it's also important to know the colonists also liked a representative government, where the people had a say in government decisions. This was not a very common practice back in the day. So the colonists really loved the idea of a representative type government. Now, in the next part B, we talk about landmark English documents, so British documents. And it'll be helpful if you have your book and go to page 32. And there's a nice little visual about these documents, and it gives you good explanation on that page of these documents in detail. Speaking of books, if you need a book, I don't know if I mentioned this in my last video, please contact the school. Even if after break you have to go and get it, I guarantee you can. So please do that. Now, one of the first pieces of documents that the British had that was monumental was something called the Magna Carta. This was signed by King John. This was one of the older kings in England, and this was passed in the 1200s, and it limited the king's power. As crazy it may seem, the king actually limited his own power in order to make sure that his people didn't rebel against him. So it's important to know that the Magna Carta was a huge stepping stone for the British people to not be walked over by a king. The king was still there, and the king said, you know what, I'll still be king, but I need to limit my powers a little bit. That's all you really need to know about the Magna Carta. And jumping from the 1200s all the way to 1689, Parliament in England would pass the English Bill of Rights. These Bill of Rights are very similar to the United States Bill of Rights. This Bill of Rights guaranteed the people certain rights, certain freedoms. Now, they were different than the ones we're familiar with in the United States, but it's the same idea. If you notice, 1689, we passed our Bill of Rights in 1791. So it was just over 100 years later, the United States would have their Bill of Rights, and we would have our own government. So this is what the British did. This was the documents that they had. These ideas, these documents, would influence colonists and their ideas of freedom and independence later on. Now we're going to talk about the 13 colonies. The biggest thing about this section is we're not going to talk about each individual colony because we don't have enough time for that, even though I would love to in history. I'd love to go into details about each colony. We're only going to talk about two different types of colonies. First one is proprietary colonies, and the other one is charter colonies. Colonies such as Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware were proprietary colonies. These were colonies that were not a proprietor, so a proprietor was in charge. Now, proprietor, and I'm going to type it here, was a friend of the king. And friend, or close ally, or whatever you want to call them, was in charge. And they were given direct power from the king. And whatever the proprietor wanted, it was basically what the king wanted. And that proprietor gave land, they gave jobs, they gave everything in these colonies. So whatever land or whatever job or whatever anything had to go through, you had to go through this proprietor. And a good chunk of the colonies were proprietary colonies. Now, this wasn't the case for all colonies. And if you're confused about this, we'll cover this more in our additional notes. But just know that proprietary colonies means proprietor was in charge. That was a friend of the king. And they divided up jobs and land and all those things that we take for granted of rights and freedoms. Now, the charter colony, which were Connecticut and Rhode Island, they were able to govern themselves. They did not have a proprietor. They got to make up their minds themselves. They got to divide up the land, the jobs, or whatever they had to do in their government. They got to make those decisions. They were still had to pay taxes and stuff to Britain, and they still were under British rule, but they had way more freedoms compared to the proprietary colonies. So that was section 1. If you need to pause the video and write what I have here down before I move up, please do so. The next section is section 2. This is talking about the coming of independence. So the British colonists had to deal with British policy. And one of the first policies they had that they did not like was that the British was raising taxes. The taxes was due to the constant wars the Great Britain kept getting into, and the colonists were the ones being punished for it. And many of you that, if you were in class in our bell ringer, were saying that one of the reasons why they wanted to leave the British Empire was because they had no representation, no taxation without representation. That only means that they didn't have a voice in Parliament. They didn't get to make up their mind. They didn't get to get that choice, and they were not happy about it. So the colonists were upset with this taxing, and one of the things they taxed was tea, and the colonists loved tea. And what did they do to protest or boycott the British? They went onto a British merchant ship and threw the tea overboard into the Boston Harbor, and this was called the Boston Tea Party. Many of you remember this from the first half of U.S. history, and this was this didn't start the war, but this was boiling, and this would lead to the Boston Massacre and all that stuff. So, the next part, what happened after this is that the colonists decided to come together. After the events in Boston, they decided to come together in the First Continental Congress. The colonists wanted to protest the intolerable acts. These were the acts that taxed and made more restrictive laws in the colonies. So they came together in the Continental Congress, and they came to the conclusion that they're not going to buy anything from Britain. This made the British mad. They did not like this, because that means they weren't getting any money at all now from the colonists, thus making their issue with debt worse. So this, again, would be another inching towards war. Now, this is a good reminder that this was the first time that the colonists really assembled in the colonies. So it's important to know that that was what happened at the First Continental Congress. So things would get worse, things would not get better, and they would join into the Second Continental Congress. In the Second Continental Congress, this is where I'm trying to find the right words here. This is where our government basically started. So this is where they believed everything came to be, is in this Second Continental Congress. Because what happened was that we declared independence. This is where we said we declare independence. And the Second Continental Congress ran our government during the Revolutionary War. So they ran our government during the Revolutionary War. We declared independence from Britain with the Declaration of Independence, and we wrote our new type of government. This was our rough draft of what we would eventually get now, the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation made the United States a confederation. If you remember from chapter 1, if not, go back to those videos and watch those. But a confederation meant that the local governments or the states would have more power than the national government or central government. So this established that the United States was a confederacy, and it made a bunch of rules and restrictions. And lastly, for this section, for section 2, is the states started to create their own constitutions. So the states held conventions, and they adopted a constitution. Every state, even today, we have a constitution. Michigan has a constitution. Indiana does. Georgia, Maine, California, doesn't matter which one. We all have state constitutions. And this tells us what we can and cannot do inside of our state. Now, back with the Articles of Confederation, these constitutions became more powerful than the national government. So the states were making laws, and it made them more powerful than the national government because we were a confederacy. And these beginning state constitutions, because these state constitutions have adapted over time. Michigan has updated ours at least 4 times. So most states gave the power originally to the legislator, so the people that make the laws. So they gave most of the power to the legislator, and most of them didn't even have an executive. They did not have a president or a governor. They just had the legislator, and the legislator had all the power. Obviously, this isn't the case today, but this was the case for most states at the time. And as you've seen, I had some blue parts added here. You never had to add those blue parts. I didn't mention that earlier. Just know that you can write this down. And these are the features of a state constitution. These state constitutions believed in popular sovereignty, limited government, civil rights and liberties, separation of powers, and checks and balances. So make sure we know that the constitutions, these state constitutions, believed in these. We're going to cover some of these definitions later on in chapter 3. So do not worry if you do not know what these words mean right now. For right now, that is all I'm going to cover in this video. I'm going to be making the second video now, and I'm going to post it straight to our website, because I know some classes, they got all through all of the outline. I know some classes did not get through all of this outline. So if you're in my my second and fourth hour, we only got to this point, and I will be sending a message about that in a minute. But we're going to end here with this first part. I will have a second part covering the rest of the outline. So if you have any questions, please message me or review this video in more slower if you need to. Thank you and have a wonderful day.